title of my talk is that New Zealand dairy farming has lost its competitive edge, and that was the headline for an article by Rod Oram, and I think many of you will know Rod Oram, a respected business analyst. Anyway, from my point of view, he always makes sense when he writes or talks about what's going on. And that's an absolutely appalling situation to be in, isn't it, to have lost our competitive advantage. And my questions in the talk will be, how did this happen and what must be done now? The current situation, and this is right up to date, I just read a couple of we've just heard these things in the last few days. The farmer's break-even price, which presumably is about their operating costs, is estimated to be about $5.4 per kilogram milk solids. Fonterra's current forecast milk price is $4.60. And the global trade auction this week, there were decreases rather than increases. So it's not a very cheerful situation. It's cold comfort, but dairy farmers in most other countries are also stuffed like we are here. Just to give us a bit of perspective from where we've come over the last 14 years, the column in red is the most recent data available, 2013-14, most recent full economic data that I could see. And if you look at the top two lines, what's happened in the 13-year period is milk production per hectare and per cow has increased well, which isn't surprising because that's been almost the total focus of the industry, is more milk. If you look below down below the dollars per kilogram milk solids and look at operating costs, that's where the bad news is, that operating costs have increased by about $1.67 or something. And that's where the competitive edge has gone missing. And it's worse than that, because if you look at the assets per kilogram milk solids, they've gone up very heavily too. And debt, of course, debt's been in the news. Debt has doubled in that 13 years. So it's not just operating costs, it's actually the capital structure and the stuff behind. So I think roughly the farmer now on those set of data, would have needed over an $8 payout to get a reasonable business profit. And it isn't going to happen this year, obviously. How did this happen and what must be done? How did it happen? Well, I think we were just dazzled by this $7 payout. The first $7 payout came in, I think it was 2007, and I'll show you later because costs went up by $1.30 in 1 year, something like that. It was just amazing. And it was because of that focus on milk solids production I talked about, mainly increased expenditure on feeds, and I'll show you the numbers for it later on. And then I've included in feeds supplements, grazing off, and fertilizer, because in a dairy farm, if you put fertilizer on, you're really putting it on for more feed in one way or another. And the most dangerous bit, of course, is you can't just bring in extra feed to the same system. You have to change the system. Changing the system makes a much more radical shift than just bringing in a sort of a marginal input. It's not a marginal change, it's a whole system change. And what must be done now? Well, obviously, to give a recipe of what must be done is going out on a limb, but basically return to grazing systems. And I meant to say at the beginning, I'm sure Sir Bruce Levy, being a grass person, will be glad to hear what I'm saying, is get back to grass, get back to grass. I should have said at the beginning and you wouldn't have to sit and listen to me for half an hour. But it's not as simple as that, of course. Some people can use other ways of doing things and be very successful at it. But we must reduce costs, obviously, to restore competitive advantage, and grazing systems are our best thing. I found this lovely quote in McMeekin's book, 1970 edition, top of page 5, and I can imagine McMeekin, I only heard him speaking once, but I can imagine him saying it, and the word eradicable stuck in my mind. I could hardly pronounce it to begin with, but I thought it was a wonderful statement. We must develop an ineradicable belief in low-cost milk production. And every dairy farmer should have that printed across their brain every morning and say, ineradicable. So this is what I'm meant to be talking about, and with any luck, it'll be something close to what I do. First of all, grazing systems, just extolling their virtues. The changes that have occurred in the systems, New Zealand dairy systems over the past 100 years, and it frightened me when I looked at the stuff I was presenting. I hadn't realized how incredible large the changes have been. The changes in milking systems, because that's a very important component of the whole dairy production part. And then last bit, I will extol, I will advocate very hard for once-a-day milking. And I'm delighted to hear that you had a speaker yesterday who has part of the herd on once a day. So it's not totally disreputable to this audience. We export 95% of all the milk we produce, so therefore we have to be competitive. If we're not competitive, we've got 95% of our milk that won't find a home. Grazing systems have the lowest costs both in the world and in New Zealand, and the International Farm Comparison Network has produced tables of relative costs, and grazing is always about 50 to 70% lower than even big feedlots, and certainly than confinement systems. So moving away from our basic competitive advantage of grazing is a risky thing to do. And now farmers must reduce costs, obviously, and it's nice to read about reports from discussion groups, and actually our once-a-day discussion group itself in October, that, not surprisingly, farmers are reducing inputs. It makes common sense. It doesn't mean you don't spend any money. I mean, it's easy to say reduce costs, you just sort of stop spending. Well, of course, that would be ridiculous, because farming is spending money, but it's spending money to make a profit, and the bottom line's crucial. So that's our natural competitive advantage, and I was just going to get you to imagine that we're standing in the paddock that the cows are going into tomorrow, and there'll be about 2,600 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, all green and glossy, 12 megajoules of ME. It's the best food that could be available. But if we think back 20 days in this paddock, it was only 1,600. Where's it come from? You haven't been doing anything in the paddock. It's just grown with sunlight and rain. As long as the sun gets up, and the sun will get up because the All Blacks won, and the rain, touch wood, will continue. That's a more touchy subject in a lot of districts at the moment. That grass appeared. It's a wonderfully renewable feed. And in addition, we have some cows, and they are marvellous things. They're milked, they walk to where the feed is, they harvest their own feed, they lie down and be very comfortable in the paddock, then they walk back to the milking shed. The only essential machine in that system is the milking machine. I show that one. Does anyone recognise where that might be? But it could be 1950, or it could be this year, more or less, couldn't it? For a grazing system. And I think that's one of the dangers, that people look at grazing systems and think, oh, they haven't changed, they're old-fashioned, we have to do something different. But of course they have changed. There are enormous improvements in every key component: soils, pastures, animals, milking. All of them have improved. And probably the way that all the components are put together have improved too. So they're not old-fashioned. There was a very good report by Hamilton in 1944, and basically it concluded that up to 1940s, grazing was the main feed, not surprisingly. There was some hay, there was some silage, there were some crops. Crops were actually decreasing during the 30s, and the only reason that I could think of was probably the pastures were getting better, so the need for crops was being reduced. And he's saying that New Zealand was unique amongst dairy countries in the world in almost total reliance on grazed pasture all year to produce milk. And McMeekin, in his book, the 70s edition, he didn't mention anything about supplementary feeding. There was no mention about responses to supplements, no mention of palm kernel, no mention of maize silage. There was mention of grazing, hay, silage, crops. So clearly it persisted, its dominance persisted through to the 70s. And there's some data from a Dairy Board survey in 1966-67 showing that 84% of farms purchase no feeds. Some of them might graze some dry cows off, some of them might purchase some heifers, but 84% purchase no feed. The 16% that did purchase feed, a bit of hay, a bit of silage, and a bit of mangles. And you can imagine mangles would be probably thrown into a trailer by hand, so it was a bit different in those days. Huge changes. I think maize silage started to become important in the 1980s, I think, didn't it? It was sort of developing then. By 1990s, it was well established. Palm kernel, I think, first time I met it, I think, was in the late 1990s. And it's increased. In fact, Dorothy and I drove past a giant swap truck and trailer unit near Payatura on the way down today. But now I think palm kernel and maize silage make up about 4 million tonnes, something like that total, which is about 15%, equivalent to 15% of the whole dairy herd's requirements, annual requirements, something like that. It's enormous. And you can see in this slide, here's the dairy in the blue on the left, that's the Dairy New Zealand systems. Systems 1 and 2, low feed input with less than 14% purchase feed. Systems 4 and 5, high feed inputs, more than 20%. In 2001, 70% were low input. In 2013, 13% were low input. And when you think that those low input farms are our competitive advantage farms, we now only have 13% of them, you have to say, where are we? And if you came to the Manawatu now and said, I want to see a Systems 1 farm, I don't think I'd know one. I'd have to hunt very hard to find one. And the high feed input systems have gone up. So huge changes just in a very short time. These are the years between which costs went up. And you can see that operating costs, 364 in the 2006-7, operating costs up by $1.27, I think $1.28 next year. One jump. Just amazing how it jumped so quickly in such a short time. And it was mainly in feeds, grazing off, and fertilizer. Yeah. What I'm going to show you now, this is the first of 6 slides, just to show you, if we were looking around dairy farms now, you would expect to see some or all of these things. Now, a feed, and one of the things, you know, you might tend to detect sort of cynicism about me. Some very good farmers, very profitable, very efficient farmers use some or all of these things. But they do them very well, of course, and they use them very effectively. So I'm not saying they're bad. All of them are very expensive things in themselves, and many of them increase the cost of the system because of what you've done. So they're not bad, but because they cost money, you have to use them very well to make sure you make a profit. A feed pad, I mean, if you're going to feed forage supplements, you need to have somewhere sensible to feed it, otherwise you waste a whole lot of silage. You've all seen tracks of silage going to waste in the paddocks. It's too expensive to be doing that. So a feed pad is good common sense. If you have a feed pad, the feed doesn't get there on its own. You have to have a feed-out equipment, and you have to have a person on the feed-out equipment, and you have to load the silage into the feed-out equipment. And that takes longer than you think, and it costs more than you think. And usually this extra labour comes in at a time when you have no time for extra jobs. So it changes the requirement for people. If you're going to feed a lot of silage, you have to make it. And if I see this stuff going around, I just stop and watch. I used to make grass silage with a sickle bar mower and a buck rake in Northern Ireland about 150 years ago. And you can imagine that watching these hoovers going around the paddocks, I just sit and watch them for an hour, just admiring them. But I do realise they're very expensive. So that's usually the contractor, of course. But I was just looking at some baleage. I think Cockett should have a look at what does baleage really cost in relation to the price of milk solids. I'll bet that baleage is not worth it for milk solids at the current price, because baleage is an expensive thing. Silage is relatively expensive. The other thing is, as soon as you try and conserve forage, there's enormous risk of waste of forage. So you harvest 100 tonnes. If you do it well, you probably end up getting 90 tonnes down the cow's throat. If you do it badly, you might end up getting only 50 tonnes down the cow's throat. And that has a big effect on the cost of what actually goes down the cow's throat. Now, some people are even advocating cow barns. And I'm trying not to let... And here's a freestall. It's a brilliant building. In Northern Ireland, I'd have loved to have had one of those. But in New Zealand, if you have to do that, you have to have a very good reason for it and have gone through the numbers very carefully. Because the feed doesn't get in there on its own. It has to be Sorry, I'm pointing at the back because I'm looking at the one behind you all. It's a marvellous system, but it carries other costs with it. And I heard the term heavy metal disease in England about 20 years ago on a dairy farm, and heavy metal disease is alive and well in New Zealand, and it's a very expensive disease to get into. And I just return you back to grazing. Isn't that beautiful? That clears the mind, just by contrast, doesn't it? I think it's a lovely one. Dorothy insisted that I include this slide because that's what heavy metal disease represents for small-scale dairy farmers in Brazil, and particularly because we used to drive a Beetle when we were first married. Right, milking systems. Now, for many or most of you, milking systems are dead boring, I think. But in a grazing system, a fully developed grazing farm, milking, the need to milk twice a day, the morning and night, dominates the day's work, routine. And it's a dominant factor. So anything you can do in the milking system to make it more efficient has a big effect, not just on the milking, but on the whole farm system. And I'll give you some examples over history. Right now, our once-a-day discussion group, and Luis Pelufo from Argentina here is a member with one of his herds on once a day. I don't know that there's anyone else from once a day. Oh, Graham. Yeah, where's Graham? Graham Edwards is a member of our group. He's up in Northland with at least one of his herds on once a day. So we've got a discussion group of once-a-day farmers, and they have proven without any doubt that eliminating one milking for the whole... Well, Nicola, you've got a once-a-day herd too. Sorry, Nicola. Forgot. That eliminating one milking per day can be profitable and successful. And I'll talk about that as well. Hand milking. And, it's hard to imagine sort of working in those conditions. And they were able to manage about 10 cows per person. It took probably about 10 or 12 minutes to hand milk a cow. The machine came in New Zealand very quickly between 1910 and 1915, and by 1920 well established. So the machine was removing the milk, but still people were doing a lot of manual work. They were washing the udders, they were massaging the udders, they were probably squirting milk from the teats before the cups went on, and then doing some squirting afterwards. So there's still quite a lot of manual contact. And we've doubled the number of cows that a person could manage on a farm by the time saved in there. So if we move through, I think that might be the old dairy cattle research unit at Massey. I'm not sure, but it's very similar to it. Shed materials have improved, concrete and steel, internal walk-through, so now the car doesn't have to walk out through the back wall. It can go through an internal race and come out at the back of that photograph. But still, there's some massage and stimulation going on in the 1950s, or a lot of it rather, and still you're just milking one cow at a time. You have to get one cow into the bale, one cow out. So it's individual cow milking. The next revolution was the herringbone. The herringbone introduced batch milking. So now you're bringing in 8 cows or 10 cows or 15 cows. And that offered the potential for fast milking. It had started in the late 1950s, progressed very rapidly through the 1960s. But they very soon, if you've moved to a herringbone, you found that you couldn't milk fast if you insisted on massaging the cow and spending a minute stimulating the cow before you put the cups on. Because the limiting factor wasn't the shed, it was the time that you had in the shed. So what happened? You can see that they were able to milk 70 cows per person in the herringbone shed. Big improvement in output per person. In the 1950s, most cows needed stimulation because they'd always had it. Doug Phillips did an experiment in 1955-56, and he found that cows that weren't stimulated decreased production by 30% in terms of kilograms of milk fat per cow. Nevertheless, farmers, having gone into herringbone shed, stopped stimulation. They stopped stimulating even though the research showed that they could get 30% more per cow by stimulating, because they knew that they couldn't milk enough cows they couldn't milk fast enough if they continued stimulating. So the cows that needed stimulation didn't produce enough milk, of course, because they weren't getting stimulation, so they were culled. And by the 1970s, Doug Phillip did another experiment in 1974, and he found that the response was to stimulation, the same stimulation he'd done in 1956, was 0 to 6%. So there was almost no response. The national herd had changed genetically in terms of whether it needed stimulation or not. The same sort of thing has been going on in once-a-day herds in New Zealand, in Argentina, that when you change to once a day, you find that some cows don't suit it, and you cull them. Many or most of those can be sold to twice-a-day farmers because they'll do very well in twice a day, but they just don't suit once a day. We don't know why, but that's the case. The future, I mean, I'm presuming that herds will get bigger as they have done for years and years. And if you insist on being old-fashioned and milking twice a day, then you will have to invest more and more in large, more automated milking systems. And that costs, obviously. Or if you're on once a day, you can milk an awful lot of cows through a relatively simple system. Within the discussion group, we've got several herds of over 600 and over milking in 40 bale herringbone. I met a man in June at our once-a-day conference for the first time. Last season, he milked 2,500 cows through a 60 bale rotary, running the rotary for about 12 hours. Very efficient use of a very expensive piece of capital equipment. This year, he was planning to do 3,000 cows. I think I've convinced myself, and because of some very sensible farmers have convinced themselves, and that makes me think, well, I'm not completely lunatic, that once a day is a perfect fit with grazing systems, and for a number of reasons, and that's what I'm trying to explain here, is that in the peak of lactation, on grazing systems, modern cows cannot eat enough pasture by grazing to meet their energy demand. So they're in negative energy balance, so they lose condition. And that is a problem. And thin cows and probably lower fertility is associated with that. On once a day, the peak daily yield is reduced. For example, if you're doing well, you'd be doing 1.8 to 1.9 per cow per day on once a day. You'd be doing 2 to 2.4 or something on twice a day, something like that. So once a day knocks the milk production down a little bit, knocks the energy demand down a little bit, knocks the loss of body condition. Most good cows lose body condition on once a day, but not so fast, not so much. And their fertility is much better. Once a day also reduces the distances that have to be walked, obviously, and also the amount of time that has to be spent standing on concrete. The fact that the distances walked are reduced means that land that was inaccessible for milking cows could become accessible. And I'm just talking to someone today who was saying that they had included land at the end of a long, thin farm, been able to do that with once-a-day cows. They could walk them to those distant paddocks now because they weren't coming to the shed twice a day. So I think for all those reasons, once-a-day and grazing systems, New Zealand grazing systems, are perfectly fitted together. The only properly done survey that's been done of once-a-day farms, which is a commentary on what has not been done, is 22 farms. The black column of data represents those 22 farms in 2003 when they were milking twice a day. The blue set of data represents their performance in 2005 when they were on once a day. You'd need to go into the details. Milk production went down by about 5%, which is actually not too bad. Couldn't work out stocking rate because it was difficult with the data that was available. Milk income went down by 5% also, obviously, but these guys were able to reduce their expenditure by 24%, 26%. So consequently, the cash surplus increased by 15–16%. Now that sort of data doesn't put a bad light on once-a-day milking, does it? It's never received any publicity. It's published in the once-a-day proceedings for a conference in 2007. I've never seen it appear in any publicity except what I've done myself. There's a set of data from Dairybase, an enormously valuable resource, and this is for 27 once-a-day farms, and they're probably in their early days on once-a-day, their early seasons. And then on the right-hand column is a New Zealand average. Now you look at that set of data, and you can see 310 per cow on once-a-day compared with 370, under 800 per hectare compared with over 1,000. I wouldn't be interested in that, no. If I'm a twice-a-day cocky, why would I go once a day? If I didn't have the return on assets figure down the bottom, I would dismiss once a day completely. So have a look at the return on assets figure. What does that mean to you? How can it be a higher return on assets for the once-a-day farms with that really dreadful performance data? They're probably on marginal land, on rolling to hilly country. So if you look at a set of data, and it's very difficult to actually do it, how do we know whether this farm is actually doing very well on what it's got, or it's actually ratchet on very good opportunities? And without a return on assets or some estimate of the land value, it's very difficult to do. So again, if you look at that data hard, that actually says for those farms, probably once a day is the very good thing. And in fact, that we have a few members who are on that sort of land, and they say they couldn't get the same return on it with using any other alternative. Might be different now with beef and milk prices, but that's what they were saying. This one here, I include it for the bottom line, really, but I'll bore you with some of the details first. Leo and Rebecca Vollebrich, they're only 30 kilometres away from here. They're on top-class Wairarapa land, flat, irrigated, probably growing 16, 17 tonnes of dry matter, so they're certainly not marginal. They've been once a day for 8 seasons. Their physical performance per hectare and their operating profit puts them in the top 20% of all farms. Twice a day, whatever. Now, I did talk to someone, a researcher, about these guys and say, well, they're pretty impressive. And he said, oh, the person said, well, they'd be good farmers whatever they're doing. But that's missing the point. These guys are equaling the top 20% with much less effort, much less energy, much less stress, much less involved in that way. And the real reason, as I said, I put them up is because in 2011 and 12, they purchased a dry stock farm, converted that to dairying, and installed a once-a-day system. Now, and they invested between $5 and $10 million. And these guys are Dutchies. And they installed a once-a-day system, so that gave me confidence in once-a-day systems. I don't think you would argue with that, and certainly if you went to the farm, you couldn't. Future efficient grazing systems, and I put Dave's name in here because I'm a friend of Dave from years and years and years, but he did start off this work, and this has to be our future, really, I think, to play to our natural competitive advantage of grazing. The only thing that Dave missed out, and he probably wasn't allowed to include it, was future efficient grazing systems and once-a-day milking, all in the same go. And I can't see how we wouldn't be unbeatably competitive once we've done that. The one proviso is that we have to breed cows that suit once-a-day milking, and we have to have sires identified that suit once-a-day milking. And the key points are very simple. You'd pick them all anyway. High genetic merit cows for whatever system you're working with. Moderate stocking rates, not high stocking rates. Dry cows grazed off, makes sense all sorts of ways. And low feed inputs. Excellent management, pastures and cows and staff, everything. High herd fertility, and with once-a-day milking that will be no problem at all. And a low annual replacement rate, so you don't have to carry too many relatively unproductive non-milking heifers. Milked once a day, obviously. Nitrogen applications and leached pretty low productive, profitable and sustainable, and I would expect unbeatably competitive. And I just have a plea to farmers and advisors. And I only put this one up recently because I got a message, an email from a farmer, and he said, this is my targets for next year, and the targets were just milk solids. And I knew he had his numbers, he had his dollar data, but he didn't put it up. It didn't feature in the target. We cannot have targets of physical things only and then expect to make a profit if we don't have a target of a cost alongside the physical thing. And that ineradicable business from McMeekin, I reckon that deserves to be quoted much more often than it has been. I hope Sir Bruce would have approved of going back to grass, and I've enjoyed talking to you, and thanks for your patience. Thank you.